This tutorial about the Firmware Update Tool of the ESCON Studio shows the recommended procedure to update the firmware. The firmware is the internal operating system that determines the functionality of an ESCON device. The firmware is subject to continuous development as part of an ongoing improvement process, and therefore it is updated on a regular basis. For the firmware update, the ESCON controller just needs to be connected to the PC via USB. There's no need for an extra power supply. There are 3 different possibilities to start the Firmware Update tool. Select one by clicking. Important! The firmware update is a critical procedure. Do not interrupt. Confirm by pressing the button that you have read the warning. Press Next. Select the options for Firmware Update Mode and Parameter Update Mode. Update with the latest installed firmware. The controller will be updated with the latest firmware that is installed on the PC. Place the cursor on the blue info icon to check the latest firmware version. Select firmware. You can select the firmware from versions that are installed on the PC. Select the desired parameter update mode. Default parameters. The default parameters, it is the original factory settings, will be transmitted to the controller. Thereby, the actual saved controller parameters will be overwritten and will be lost. Keep actual parameters. During the firmware update, the actually saved parameters on the ESCON controller will remain unchanged. Choose this option if your ESCON controller is already parameterized correctly to your needs. Press Next. Here you can select the desired firmware version. The left column displays the actually installed firmware version of the controller. In the right column, you can select the desired firmware from the valid versions that are currently installed on your PC. If the desired firmware version should not be displayed, press the button Browse Firmware. You can select the firmware from the valid versions that are currently installed on your PC. It is possible to display information on the selected firmware version. Press Next. Pressing the Start button launches the firmware update. Important! The firmware update is a critical procedure. Do not interrupt while in progress. In case of interrupted update procedure, remember the warning and proceed as follows. First, reconnect the controller to the USB interface. Then, restart the firmware update wizard. And finally, resume the wizard. The firmware update history will be recorded automatically. Once the firmware update is completed, you may view the history by pressing the corresponding button. Press Finish. Check the firmware version by pressing the About the ESCON controller icon. Press OK, and the ESCON is now ready to be used with the selected firmware.